Without further ado, it's over to you, Bill. We know you're there somewhere.
Thank you, Ian. I was just thinking, it's not for nothing that where I'm speaking from, Oldham, is also known as the Wastelands. So, you know, there is something in that. Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for inviting me. When Ian asked if I would do a talk, I thought it would probably be impossible to cover both South Midland divisions, and even probably impracticable to try to do both the Western Front and the Italian experiences of the 48th. He agreed, as did Derek more recently, that if I cover the Western Front, we may have time and inclination to talk a bit about the Italian experience during the Q&A. I am aware as well, I've been told today that that would be taking us into kick-off time for England football team. Apparently, it holds no attraction for me, but my little brother, who does follow the team a lot more closely, assured me that as far as the way they're playing at the moment, I could talk about the sex life of the amoeba and people would still find that considerably more interesting. So I'll go ahead with it. I also thought that as it was unlikely to be able to add anything to what Ian has already told you and written for a far wider audience as well about the Bucks Battalion, I'll cover the division rather than just one battalion within it. This soldier here is a wonderful chap. I've loved this photograph since I first saw it. To me, that sort of sums up the pre-war territorials, a callow, pasty-faced youth. I'll just go back to, those are the topics that I will cover. And then, as I say, if we have time, we can perhaps look at the Italian concern later on. Now, I'm sure most of you are aware of this. This is the South Midland Division as it was on the 1st of August, in other words, just immediately before it was embodied and mobilized. The three infantry brigades, which later became 143, 144, and 145. The artillery brigades, I haven't put the Roman numerals of what they became later on. Only two field companies, of course, to begin with. That was soon expanded to three. The three field ambulances, and then the mobile veterinary section and the divisional train. Now, the division was looked after by 6 county associations, 6 territorial force county associations, which was about sort of average-ish for most divisions. If you compare it to the 47th London Division, or 2nd London, that had 1 association looking after it, but the 51st Highland had 20 associations, and the 52nd Lowland and the 53rd Welsh had 15 associations each, which did tend to complicate making decisions, as you might imagine. But of the 14 TF divisions on the eve of the war, only the North Midland was closer to establishment than the South Midland was. The South Midlands infantry brigades were 83% of officers and 90% of other ranks to establishment. Like all TF battalions, they suffered from recruitment and retention problems, but annual camp attendance seems to have been reasonably good. These are jumping badly. Well, the units had their quota of permanent staff. Some of the drill halls were equipped with recreational facilities for the other ranks. But the opportunity to earn overtime money, of course, at work rather than attend the rifle ranges on Saturday afternoons or Sundays, was always a considerable attraction. The War Office thought that the TF's musketry was well below what it should have been. I hope you can see the caption on the cartoon there. I'll read it out just in case you can't. The first territorial says, "Well, what do you think of our manoeuvres, Bill?" And the second territorial, who is hitherto unacquainted with field day, says, "Thank heaven we've got a nevy." And that's the sort of fairly common opinion of the public and the War Office as well. The 6 yeomanry regiments administered by the 6 county associations were pretty much at full strength, as were the supporting arms. They've been recruiting well as well. But nevertheless, and despite some inevitable tensions between the associations and the divisional commander, which was just par for the course, The men were kitted and equipped, and there was a system of separation allowances in places should mobilization ever be called. The commanding officers knew the location of their units, war stations, and the timetable by which they would be reached. There had been the usual disputes over grants and general financing between the associations and the War Office, and actually a slightly more unusual one as far as this division was concerned, over the request by the War Office for the associations to raise a cyclist company. That was the advertisement that the War Office wanted to use, but the associations refused, in fact, not least because they discovered that the cyclist company was not actually going to be used by the division. So why on earth should they bother recruiting for it? What remained very much unknown, of course, were answers to the very crucial questions of how well trained the units would prove to be and how quickly they would respond if an enemy launched a swift invasion or a large-scale raid on vulnerable points. Many in the War Office had little real faith that the territorials would be up to the job. The traditional belief among TF members that the War Office had little sympathy with the movement as a whole, and this feeling was exacerbated when the new armies were formed. The perception was that the Kitchener formations received priority in the issue of kit and equipment, and the CO of 8 Worcester spoke for many when he complained. He said, "It seems unfair that we should not receive the same facilities for training as the new army." That was the rifle range which should have appeared earlier, but I'll go on to this one. The battery, the lack of equipment and kit and serviceable rifles and artillery pieces, as well as the seemingly sort of internal cold and wet weather of the winter of 1914-15 severely hampered the training, as you can imagine. And it seems likely, I think, that the RFA brigades had only one period of 9 days training on Salisbury Plain, and these were spent down in the depths of January 1915. And the acute shell shortage, which of course was beginning to be felt in France, meant that the 15-pounders, which were these obsolete guns, many of which had last seen action in the Boer War, and the 5-inch batteries were allocated only 50 practice shells or rounds, and the 4.7-inch howitzers had even fewer for the allocation for training. And in March 15, if we jump onto there, the South Midland was the 3rd of the Territorial Force divisions in a matter of weeks to deploy to the Western Front. The North Midland and the 2nd London divisions had gone in February and early March. And all 3 of these formations have been elements of the Central Forces 3rd Army under the overall command of General Sir Ian Hamilton of Gallipoli fame shortly, or intimately shortly. In August 1914, Hamilton had thought that the average physique of the Warwickshire Brigade troops was splendid, and he was and above average, he thought as well. And he recorded his bemusement somewhat in December as to why the War Office had selected the North Midland to be the first of the TF divisions to go. The decision probably had much to do with the great pressure that was placed on the War Office by the North Midland GOC. He was, of course, Major General Montague Stuart Wortley, who made himself a complete and utter nuisance to the War Office for weeks on end. The authorities' decision, as I say, came as a surprise to Hamilton, who believed that the South Midland was, he thought, clearly above the rest in its training and its preparations. And he thought that some of the battalions were, some of the battalions, especially those of the South Midland Brigade, he used the word superb. In a letter to Churchill, he described the immense divisional esprit de corps in the South Midland. But Hamilton had faith in the auxiliary, but given the problems the South Midland and other TF divisions had in trying to obtain equipment, training, and decent weaponry and horses and vehicles and so on, it's difficult to take seriously all the praise Hamilton bestowed on the TF. He himself had dreams of there being a TF army as part of the BEF, and he imagined himself as its GOC army. It is evident, though, I think, that when the South Midland entrained for Southampton in late March 1915, it was reasonably well trained in the theory and the nature of war, perhaps, but we could say it was naive in its practicalities and the character of the war. But having said that, again, one officer who went with the division thought that his battalion was in the most excellent fighting trim, he described it, and with all unfit men had been weeded out, and the troops, he said, were very different from those somewhat pasty-faced individuals who had left Birmingham on the 4th of August 1914. Now, there's a lengthy period of trench acclimatization was done in the Plug Street sector under 4th Division, regular 4th Division. This is just a shot of Plug Street Wood Cemetery. The row that you see in front of you are early deaths from the Gloucesters, and over there by the gate there are oxen, bucks and bucks as well. A lovely little cemetery, I think deep in the wood. Now, for some reason which is not particularly clear, GHQ clearly decided that the formation would be better utilised in instructing newly arriving divisions in trench acclimatisation rather than employing them in an offensive role. Rumours swept through the division actually that they were going to go to Egypt or Gallipoli, and so when they were told they were going to go, or when they arrived at the head return area in July 1915, it had come as something of a surprise. On taking over the line, the division quickly discovered that the enemy had superiority in just about everything, artillery and close support weapons, and that the Germans were as eager as the South Midlanders claimed to be to contest control of no man's land. A lot of the work they had to do was, as you can see then, of course they didn't have steel helmets at the time. This is not, these are not 48 Div, I don't know who these are to be honest, but 48 did do an awful lot of digging and road clearing and so on during this initial period. And then they went close to Gomicourt Park, and the arts and the skills of raiding and patrolling were gradually being developed right across the BEF, and the 48th was no exception. The first attempt by a battalion of the division to get into the enemy's line was considered a success, and they analysed why they'd managed to do it, and they put it down to the fact that there was a good intelligence gathering. They'd rehearsed repeatedly over replica trenches. The infantry thought the barrage had been effective, and there was good cooperation between the supported and the supporting arms. Communications had been okay, but they came to the same conclusion as many, or just about all, I'd imagine at the time, troops who had experienced with the British hand grenades, and decided they were more of a danger to the user than they were to the enemy. But learning from experience was taken seriously within the division, and after most raids, as I say, the reports were written and post-mortems were held. After another large one, one officer thought that the shrapnel barrage had been irregular, but that the artillery and the trench mortars appeared to have done what was expected of them. The fire of the heavies was particularly effective, he thought. But again, like the grenades, the Bangalore torpedoes were universally condemned as being just utterly unreliable. They had a problem apparently bringing back prisoners that they had captured from trench raids. They would be sort of bringing 2 or 3 back, and then those Germans were somehow dead before they reached the British trenches. So the division thought that, well, this is clearly not the idea, because we're supposed to be bringing back live Germans for intelligence purposes. So it was decided that certain NCOs should be told off to escort any captured prisoners back, and know that they were going to be responsible for their safety. They also thought that the means of sort of signaling withdrawal needed addressing, as did more training to develop the command and initiative and leadership skills. In other words, the usual sorts of things that you'd expect from any novice division. The plans and procedures for the division's own raids, as I say, may have been evolving, but the response to an enemy raid revealed a lack of common and effective procedure between the artillery and the infantry. The divisional artillery's response to the criticism from the infantry, who said that the barrage was very late and very weak. The CRA, in defense of his gunners, claimed that his guns had reacted as quickly and as efficiently as they were supposed to do. But he did acknowledge that, yeah, one of his brigade commanders had made what he called an error of judgment. But he had shown initiative, you know, sort of covering each other's backs as much as possible. And similar appreciations were being made right across the BEF. But it was obvious that what we would today call the physical component of British fighting power was clearly not the equal of the enemy's. He appeared to have bottomless reserves of Miniverter and artillery shells, and was proving himself to be a very capable opponent in the art of trench raiding. And like many other divisions, 48th was largely on the receiving end of this imbalance. As the new army divisions came into the line, they, like the 48th, realised that along with their inexperience, they were certainly operating at a significant disadvantage. This was brought home, if you like, in mid-May, when the enemy made a pretty determined effort on the 4th Berkshires. The Germans created mayhem in the Berkshire positions and trenches, and they succeeded in killing 18 of them, wounding more than 50, and the Germans disappeared, taking 29 of the Berkshires back with them. Raiding was just one of the elements, of course, of trench warfare that was attracting considerable British thought and development in terms of weapon capability and trading. And with the increasing practical experience, which was being used to improve the conceptual and the tactical skills, during late 15 and early 16, the British were demonstrating an increasing nous and understanding of the operational environment in which they were fighting. But within the 48th Div, some units or their brigade commanders, it may well have been, I think appear to have been rather more reluctant than others to undertake the raids. 145 Brigade, for example, did significantly fewer raids than those conducted by the division's other two brigades. And even within brigades themselves, it's clear that some battalions did more than others. If we take example of 143, in other words, the Warwickshire Brigade, which was the most active of the three, 5 and 8 Warwicks seem to have done no raids at all during their first full year in France, whereas 7th Warwick had already attempted 3. But during this period, casualties, of course, increased. Here's Heatherton Cemetery. Again, many of you will have been here, and you'll know that what we're looking at on the side of the where the plots are close to the Cross of Sacrifice, they're done fairly much in regimental rows. Not always, but it's rather a nice grouping in Heatherton. They've been fortunate, certainly. The other rank Fatalities during its first 15 months in France until the opening of the Somme were, I think, probably round about 560, 570. Now, several TF divisions, of course, have lost that number almost in single days. And it was events like this and attitudes like this which Henry Ogle, an officer in 8 Warwicks, later decided and recorded. To him, it was clear that the division were not first-class troops, because why would they just be sort of hanging around not particularly active areas and taking no part in offensives? But other territorials in other units echoed this early lack of confidence in themselves, or the fact that they thought the authorities didn't think much of them. And they believed that their role in that year, 1915 in particular, appeared to be really just to support the regular army or as plain forward simple line holders. We move on to the Somme. By late June 16, 48th Div was filling the gap between 4th Division to its south and 31st Division to its north. It was part of 8th Corps in Rawlinson's 4th Army. The division knew the area better than any other formation, but rather than it being used at Serre instead of 31st Division, or on the southern flank of the diversionary assault at Gillemont, the reconstituted 56th 1st London Division was brought down to make the attack. It seems strange to me that the division wasn't used because it did know the area, say, better than most. But in terms of length of time, the South Midland was in theory among the most experienced divisions in the area. It had lost 37 officers killed or died of wounds since its arrival, but the GOC had been in post for over a year, the CRE a little longer, and 2 of the infantry brigadiers had been in command since sort of fairly early-ish 1915. And although it's certain that at least 75% of the August 1914 battalion COs of the division's 13 battalions, if we include 5 Sussex as the pioneers, 75% of those have been replaced by early 16. But there, of course, remain considerable numbers of pre-war officers, majors, captains, subalterns, and so on, NCOs and other ranks in the units of all the brigades. And these men, as well as the drafts which had arrived from their second line units, I think maintained the battalion's sense of local cohesion and identity, and also the unit's TF ethos and traditions. The 2 battalions which were used on 1st of July were, of course, the 6th and the 8th Warwicks. They lost very heavily. The 6th Warwick lost 10 officers, 148 other ranks dead, and the 8th Warwicks, I think it's 12 and 223 dead. 8th Warwicks, in fact, come 8th in Martin Middlebrook's list of 32 battalions, which sustained more than 500 casualties that day. The barrage had broken some of the wire in front of the Heidenkopf from the Redan Ridge, but the lack of heavy guns had meant, of course, that the more substantial defences remained intact, and the battalions lost as a consequence. But across the BEF, again, the physical component of British fighting power clearly showed to be inadequate. There was insufficient artillery power, the limited availability of light mobile infantry fire support, the inadequate training, especially the failure of the advancing troops to mop up Germans left in dugouts were crucial factors. And these elements, together with the effectiveness of the enemy barrage on no man's land and the enfilade machine gun fire from the flanks, where the other formations haven't managed to get forward, condemned 11 Brigade and the 2 attached Warwicks to failure. After the 1st of July, the learning period, if you like, begins for the BEF. If we just look at this map, there's the main Albert, Bapaume Road, Pozières, and so on. If you find Skyline Trench, just southwest of Moquet Farm, and then if you look over to the extreme left, Leipzig Redoubt and Thiapval, it's Skyline Trench in that area there where the division was going to spend a fair amount of its time. The Battles Nomenclature Committee designated the division's later actions in July and early September around Ovillers and Skyline Trench. It called them tactical actions. And likewise, the later tours in the trenches around the SARS in October, November were also classified as tactical actions. So in other words, the division didn't take part in any of the real set-piece battles of the Somme, but it did spend longer in the line than most other divisions did. Now that's a photo taken from Skyline. You can see Thiapval there on the right, and that bunch of trees on the skyline over to the left are the trees which have regrown around the Leipzig salient. Lots of bombing operations around here on the Pozières and Thiapval ridges, but they made slow progress. They involved considerable hand-to-hand fighting in what were very confined positions. The battalions would frequently take German post or trench only to lose them when the enemy counterattacked. Cooperation with units or other divisions on its flanks and even between its own brigades at times and battalions was not always as secure as it should have been. But again, this is part of the learning process, and it did improve during the early autumn, as it did across the board at BEF, with the regular appointment of liaison officers. Again, this is familiar territory, I'm sure, to many of you. Skyline Trench heads towards Moquet Farm. Moquet Farm is not quite in the same place as it used to be. And then looking in the other direction, down Mash Valley towards Ordeer. And I think we could say that, like most other formations during July and August, the division didn't really have very many opportunities to develop the conceptual component of fighting power. When it came to prolonged periods of fighting, tactically, you could say the division was about almost as innocent as many of the new army formations which were operating nearby. And it certainly suffered from the same disadvantages as they did when they engaged in close range bombing attacks. And certain operational points were always being made in reports after these attacks, like that time needed more time to recce the objectives and relay the knowledge that had been picked up from the recce to their platoon commanders and NCOs. Troops needed more time to reach their jumping off points. More time was wanted between the issue of orders and the move forward for the troops to draw stores and eat and rest. But I mean, we can say that the infantry's physical component was improving, because the supply of essential close infantry support weapons like the grenades, the Mills bombs coming, of course, Lewis guns, Stokes mortars, and so on, that they were increasing. The weapons were being assimilated into tactical actions. Soldiers died suggests that the 4 Warwick battalions suffered a total of 550 other ranked fatalities during July. Now, as far as I can see, the drafts which arrived before the opening of the Somme had come from those units' 2nd or 3rd line formations, very largely. And the great majority of July deaths in 143, in other words, the Warwickshire Brigade, was certainly of volunteer territorials from Warwickshire. During the campaign, a few very fortunate TF formations and units did continue to receive sort of vaguely preferential treatment and remained able often to draw drafts from largely their own traditional catchment areas. The South Midland didn't fall into that special category, but it does seem, I think, to have been fortunate to have had largely local men posted to it. What they did do, however, and even if the geographical origins of the drafts were satisfactory, like just about all other formations, the 48 complained about the perceived quality of these drafts, which was more or less universally thought to be pretty awful. Later on in the Somme, in October, the division moved back to the sector where it had served its long trench apprenticeship. The front trenches around Head of Turn were largely unchanged from when the division had first taken possession of them back in August 1915. There was a warning order for an attack around the middle of the month, and a flurry of conferences and so on, but and the artillery concentrated on wire cutting. But the attack was first postponed and then cancelled. And similarly, in November and December, the division was again fortunate in having its intended attacks near the Buck to Wallen cancelled. If they had gone ahead, then I think their casualty list would have been very similar to those which 50 Northumbrian Division suffered at the Butt. Again, lots of digging, of course, during the Somme, and then also in the advance towards the Hindenburg line, which we'll look at now. It was late January 1917 that the division moved down to sort of more or less opposite Peronne, a few miles down the Roman road, i.e. the one from Amiens to Saint-Quentin. It's in that area. And during this period, it again did a series of raids with varying degrees of success. They tended to be small scale, and like those attempted towards the end of February, frequently failed when they came up against uncut wire or lost direction in what was, of course, pretty absolute darkness. For their part, the Germans undertook raids as well, and one of them was on a scale which I think clearly shook the division. The Germans entered the trenches of 6 Warwick and 6 Gloucester, and after about 45 minutes of very severe hand-to-hand fighting, the Germans were finally expelled. 6 Warwick recorded 39 dead, 66 wounded, and 14 of their men having been taken back by the Germans for questioning. There was a number of smallish raids by the division, but very much in keeping with what neighbouring formations were conducting. But then an idea developed for a major one in March. And the object of this was going to be a collection of ruined farm buildings on high ground known as La Maisonnette. These, it was thought, this high ground and these buildings might hold the key to an advance to the Somme near Peronne, was thought. And that's, oh, oops, Daisy. That's what, sorry, it's not, right, stay there, that's better. That's what it looks like today. The planning for it was very detailed. There were lots of rehearsals, there were false barrages put down, there was attempts at tactical deception and so on. But in the end, just before the main raid was due to take place, the Germans decided they were going to withdraw it anyway. And this, of course, then became part of the advance to the Hindenburg line. And the division was the first into Peronne, followed the Germans into it and then out of it again. These next few weeks were all about trying to establish a momentum and then trying to maintain a tempo against an enemy who was essentially calling the shots, because he decided whether he was going to leave his rear guards and cause a bit of mayhem until they withdrew. The 48th was, during the advance, was a little less cautious than its second division, i.e. the 61st, which was to the south of it, and which in turn was less cautious than the 59th, which was the second North Midland, which was between the two of them. The supply, the general staff work and so on was affected, it seems to be, in very difficult circumstances. The field companies, the 48th, seem to have done very well as far as bridging the Somme was concerned in several areas. And in order to stay in touch with the withdrawing enemy, 2 mobile columns were formed, and the tactics employed by these columns were largely novel, because this is the first time most of these troops have ever sort of thought about a war of movement. And it was during some of the Liga training time in February that they did manage to get some practice in how to set up advanced guards and different means of deploying over open ground and so on. As they approached the Hindenburg line, one of the major continuing obstacles to progress was the danger of undiscovered German booby traps. And a mine in the HQ of 6 Gloucesters killed Lieutenant Colonel Knott, his brother, who was the adjutant, the second in command, Major Gerard, the MO who was there, and 2 other officers as well. The devastated zone across which they were approaching, this is Hagecourt, and the mines of Hagecourt, you hardly recognize it. As you can see, it's just absolutely open. There's loads of barbed wire and stuff. And this was the terrain over which they were crossing. During this advance, an attack on Centenily by 4th Gloucester was a very rushed and ill-prepared affair, which produced predictable results and an unnecessarily long casualty list. Whereas in contrast, the assaults on Epie in early April and the 3 villages to its south were very well planned and prepared. And these had more of a sort of set-piece character and demonstrated a very good planning and preparation, good coordination and liaison between the artillery and the infantry. There was developing tactical understanding by platoons, there was disciplined mopping up, and then quick and effective consolidation in what were less than favourable conditions, of course. This is it's Gillemont Farm. Now, note it's not the same spelling as the farm on the Somme, but you can see it there, just off the map on the right-hand side is the American cemetery, if you get the bearings from there. Now, the attacks on Gillemont Farm and the Knoll, which you can see just to its north, didn't always demonstrate, I don't think, the same degree of sort of situational awareness and thorough planning as had been evident for the attacks on Epping. And the strength of the enemy garrisons and the ground and the weather, the predictable tactics that were employed, and the disrupted communications between the infantry and the supporting batteries ensured that really, usually most gains were quickly counterattacked and lost. And casualties were heavy for what was still reasonably small actions. For example, 144 Brigade sustained 400 casualties on the 24th of April in taking and holding the farm. And then later, the 42nd Division, which had been at Gallipoli and then Egypt, and another just arrived on the Western Front, lost it again, and the 48th were sent up to go and regain it. And there are stories, it was Vaughan in his book who tells of fist fights in the sunken lanes between the 48th and 42nd Division troops, because the 48th were a bit teed off, that 42nd lost it, and now they had to go and regain it again. And like that of the one I mentioned earlier, the 4th Gloucesters on Santa Emilia, a couple of weeks earlier, an assault by Fort Berkshire in mid-April was one of those which had never been allowed to take place. To have ordered it to proceed in what were appalling conditions and with inadequate coordination between flanking units. On one side, the division on its right simply said, well, we're not going to attack, you can do so if you want to, but we're not, we've had no orders. The artillery was a grave misjudgment on the part of Corps and Division and the brigade commanders. But in this series of operations, I think you can say that the 48th did as badly or as well as just about all the others taking part. That's what Gillemont Farm looks like today. I really like this part of the line. I think it's easy to cycle around as well. There's no fences and hedges or anything like that. You can get across the fields easily enough. And Hargicourt, which is very close to it, and again devastated land, as you can see. But the division moved a little bit north to Beaumetz, just south of the Cambrai road, and it continued its aggressive policy of patrolling. But this was a relatively quiet period, and then the months spent in training behind Ypres allowed the division to absorb new recruits, and it was resting and preparing tactically for the next offensive, which for the 48th Div was going to be 13. And when the infantry left the training area in July 17, they were thought to be in splendid physical condition, and apparently they sang lustily on the march and were delighted when they arrived at Houtkirk, because it appeared as if every house was an estaminet, so they looked forward to getting leave passes and stuff like that. The division was not used on the first day of 13. It was part of 18 Corps, and the Corps decided that they would have the 51st Highland and the 39th Divisions as the assault formations. And then throughout the campaign, the division's involvement in the campaign was heavy, but it did also have sort of several periods of rest and training in the rear. The division's brigades were frequently unsuccessful, but of course it's difficult to condemn individual units for a lack of drive or determination, for their failures to gain their objectives, because the weather, the terrain, and the defence were resolute defence was sufficient to frustrate the best of divisions. And furthermore, I think we could say that 48 was active in some of the worst areas of the salient, where even reaching the jumping off line at the scheduled time was in itself something of an achievement. We just take three actions very briefly. The first one, 19th of August, Mont du Hivaux and Triangle Farm. It was almost an entirely successful operation. The barrage poured smoke and shrapnel onto the Saint-Julien and Langemarck Road. The tanks supporting the infantry made their way towards the objectives. 5 Warwick took and consolidated Hillock Farm and the nearby gun pits. 8 Worcester reported its operation to have been a complete success because the blockhouses, or the blockhouse, I should say, at Montaigu was stormed, and the garrison of Triangle Farm apparently fled at the approach of the tank. And furthermore, I suppose, what was considered to be another satisfactory feature of the division's first 4 days of real fighting in salient, and one which materially, I would imagine, affected morale, was the manner in which the division's casualty evacuation procedure had worked. That was praised by all and sundry in the reports that were written after. This from St. Julien, looking across to Springfield, there's the totem Moulin you can see behind, and then this one looks back, from the other direction. The land immediately in front is the civilian cemetery, which was never restored. And this was the scene on the 22nd of August, in other words, 3 days later. And this time it was a failure. The infantry certainly believed on this instance that the main reason for the lack of success was the inability of the tanks to work off-road. This hadn't mattered on the 19th of August because the German defenders had shown less determination to hold their positions than their comrades did 3 days later. And the ground in front of Springfield, as any of you have been there, I'm sure most of you have, and the village cemetery was almost impassable for infantry, and certainly so for tanks. The new attack formations and tactics which were coming out in the doctrinal pamphlets were good enough if you had good ground on which to work, but the notoriously unreliable tanks and the hopelessly bogged infantry, to try and expect them to capture the concrete islands was expecting too much. And the line moved forward about 200 yards. And then the third attack, on the 4th of October, this is from the Stromberg, as it says, across to Winchester. There's the spire of Paul Capel Church in the background. And then looking from north of Winchester back towards it, this is from County Crossroads. The tactical orders issued for this followed the common practice across Fifth Army by this time of the campaign, that you allot definite and distinct parties to deal with specifically with known and suspected strong points. There was the creeping barrage, box barrage, concrete emplacements nearby with were going to receive attention from the heavies. Liaison officers were put to liaise with the New Zealanders on the right and the Lancashire Fusiliers on the left. Sappers went in with, and the pioneers, and machine guns and trench mortars, as usual, to help with consolidation and so on. After the battle, which hadn't worked out at all well, Brigadier General Sladen criticised himself for not having moved a reserve company early enough, and he thought he had missed the opportunity. But I mean, in his defence, it's a question of timing, isn't it? Getting a battalion or a company or a platoon across such difficult and barrage ground to the right place at precisely the right time was probably going to be impossible. Lose direction and everything else, and imaginable. It's an awful problem. One CO actually did point out one of the few successes of that battle was the fact that the staff work, the divisional staff work, seemed to work okay. And of course, there is evidence to suggest that on the whole, the delays in issuing orders, which were common across every corps, were not the result of poor divisional staff work, although of course at times they could be. In none of its engagements in August or October did the division achieve all of its objectives on time. But again, this is no different to most other divisions fighting the deep. Some divisions were thought by higher command to have done particularly badly. 61st, the 2nd South Midland was one of these, but there was 42nd and 39th and 66th and several others. There's no evidence, I don't think, to suggest that 48 as a whole suffered from particularly low morale. The incidence of crime was very close to the average of other divisions, and there was no more rapid turnover of senior commanders than in any other comparable divisions. I think that the roots of unit identity, the divisional morale, which the the innate rivalry, I suppose, it fostered in the pre-war days through the trade and commerce and so on, and sports between units from neighbouring towns and cities persisted. One method which recent studies have used of assessing whether divisions were in any way out of the ordinary is to look at how often they were used in offensives. And using the official Battles Nomenclature Committee's definition of what they call major actions, I've looked at which of the non-regular British divisions fought at Loos, took part in the advance of the Hindenburg line and Messines, and also added up the number of times they were used during the Somme, at Arras, and during Third E. Now, you can see from that, hopefully, that, well, the greatest number of times any division of any of the 42 divisions used was 13 during that period, September through to November 15 to 17. And that was 37th Division. But I think the more telling thing is to divide the number of occasions the division was used by the number of months it was actually present on the Western Front. And you can see there that the average for new army divisions was 0.278 occasions. For the TF as a whole, it was 0.222, and then the overall average being 0.250. And 48th Division comes out at 0.29. And this is actually the second highest of any first line TF division, with only 7 new army divisions having a higher usage. It doesn't prove a great deal, I don't think, but it's an interesting statistic that, yeah, it was certainly up there as far as usage was concerned. Casualties, well, there's certain limitations, of course, and inconsistencies in the records, but the number of other rank deaths in the infantry amounts in total to about 5,200, and that's an average of about 400 fatalities per battalion. And if you compare those to the average losses in other battalions of their own regiments, it's very low. It's unsurprising, therefore, I think then that the total is also low in comparison to the number of men killed in other divisions. During its 32 months on the Western Front, if we take that, 48th Division lost an average of a little below 160 infantry fatalities per month. Now, if you compare that to 160, 41 British divisions suffered more than 200 per month, 17 of those of which lost more than 300 per month. So it's a low figure for 48. And it can be accounted for by its good fortune in not having to take part in any of the 1915 battles. Only 2 battalions involved on the 1st of July, as we've said. It wasn't engaged at Arras, at Bullecourt, at Messines, or at Cambrai. And because it had by then gone to Italy, it avoided the German spring offensives of 1918. And it did spend longer on the Somme and is regarded as having been involved in more battles, in inverted commas, during the campaign in the majority of divisions. But it was not engaged, as I said, in some of the offensive's most bloody encounters. And similarly, it was engaged on more occasions during 30 than most divisions, but escaped with approximately only average casualties for the campaign as a whole. Where are we? No, sorry, we've got one's missing. It should say finally, this one, because I'm just about there. During the mobilisation and training period back in the UK, unlike many of the TF divisions, the 48th was certainly fortunate not to have been dismembered and its units dispatched abroad independently. I think this may suggest that 48th was recognised as being a good division and that the authorities wanted to keep it intact. It might have been sheer coincidence, though, perhaps. I mean, the 2nd London, the North Midland, the Northumbrian, the Highland divisions were quickly engaged in major offensives soon after they landed in France. Only the South Midland and the West Riding divisions were retained as trench holders for a substantial period after their arrival on the Western Front. And in late 1917, it was probably good fortune again which determined that the division was going to go to Italy. I can't find any real reason why it was. I have a theory that the Canadians who had suffered at Passchendaele, of course, needed a quiet sector to rest and reorganize. They knew Vimy, so the 48th, which was just about there, was also in need of a period of refitting, but that could be moved easily. And so away they went to Italy, where it was able to enjoy a substantial period of rest and familiarization before it saw any significant action in the Italian mountains. If it had stayed in France, then I'm sure the fatality figures and so on would have been similar to most other divisions. The little quote I gave earlier of Henry Ogle's self-deprecating assessment of the division's status in 1915 was contradicted by several comments made later in the war. Charles Carrington noted that he said a German of 2nd Guards Reserve Division captured in a raid stated that troops of 48th Division were regarded as Schrecklich, which apparently means troops to be feared. And when a captured German general ranked British and Dominion divisions in order of merit, he put the 48th Division in 4th place. Now, in view of the division's record, these two assessments are somewhat difficult to justify, I think. And rather than basing them on any sound factual foundation, I think the comments probably had more to do with prisoners telling their captors what they believed the captors wanted to hear. It wasn't an outstanding division. It did not have any particular or spectacular success, unlike many of the other divisions, the TF1s included. It was like the majority of British divisions, I think. It was reliable, it was capable of innovation, it was agile enough to cope with the changing character of the war. It was flexible when it was required to be. It was receptive to new doctrine and ideas. It was reflective. Seemingly, it was efficiently commanded, and with the supported arm well sustained and assisted by the supporting arms, I should say. It was, in other words, I think, a capable division. I'm going to end it there. What have I done? Just under 50 minutes, call it. If anyone is still hearing me, are you there, Derek?
Yes.
Ah, right, good. Now, what do I do to? I could have been talking for the last 15 minutes, completely unknown as to whether anyone was there.
No. We've heard you loud and clear, or at least I certainly have. What you need to do, Bill, is if you can stop sharing your screen so that Ian can come on to share any questions that we might have.
Right, hold on a sec. Let me stop share. Right, we're there.
There you go.
Okay. Well, yes, well, we can still hear you, Bill, but we still cannot see you. If I could sort of start off in terms of command, and I wonder if you could say more about Fanshawe as a divisional commander, and in terms and the sort of also the brigade commanders as well.
Yeah, Fanshawe, the chocolate soldier, as he was known. Maxey, Ivor Maxey, who was one of the better commanders, better trainers and that sort of things everybody knows. And he described Fanshawe as an adequate, a fine, okay sort of commander. Nothing outstanding, but just perfectly adequate for the job. And that's, I think, always the impression I've had of him as well. He was not flash. He didn't go for the headlines or anything like that. I don't think that he was. He wasn't unnecessarily conservative, but he was conservative with his troops' lives. I think he did. He was one of the more thinking commanders at certain stages when he was prepared to call off an attack or put in a smaller number. And in fact, one of the criticisms of one of the attacks that it did at Ypres was that there was a lack of concentration of force. He didn't put sufficient battalions within the brigades in when other commanders might well have done. He was certainly, from all the records and the biographies and the autobiographies and so on that you come across from blokes who had fought with him and officers in the division, thought he was a really decent chap who did put his troops first. The defence that they put up for him, I mean, Carrington was the one who did most of the defending post-war, but there are a lot of others who said it was completely unfair that he should have been sacked in June 1918, and that he was loved by his men. I mean, most generals are described to have been loved by their men, and most of them pretty much hated, weren't they? But you know, you get the impression that Fanshawe was the sort of chap who, yes, if you had to serve under a divisional commander, there could have been plenty who were worse than he was. And the brigadiers, yeah, they don't appear to have been outstanding in any particular way. I mean, the turnover of them wasn't that great. I haven't done actually a comparison between that division along with others in the TF, but yeah, as you'd expect, they were regulars. There were only, what was it, 5-6 territorial brigadiers throughout the course of the war, and that's understandable, I suppose, given the attitudes of the day. But they seem to have been, to me, adequate for the job, but as I say, nothing outstanding. Their reports, post-battle reports, and their accounts of training and the training schemes that they put together, as opposed to ones which came down from above, as it were, appear to be perfectly adequate. No real different from others which were being disseminated around the BEF by 1917.
I mean, given that you've looked obviously at all the second line territorial divisions as well as a number of the first ones, it always strikes me really just how really the large, sort of relatively large number of very good writers who come out of that division. So you've got Graham Greenwell and Charles Carrington, Edmonds, Howard Green. It does seem, you know, an extraordinary number of very good writers.
Yeah, I'd agree with that, but you could say similar, I think, to 56th Division. That had a lot of good stuff. It might simply reflect their social background, and these were the people who just preferred to write. I mean, the 56th Div, as you know, was filled by middle-class clerks, insurance brokers, stuff like that. Those who are going to be articulate and literate as well. But yes, you're right in that. In fact, I had a slide, and it's not on this one, which it should have been, which lists all the biographies and autobiographies and memoirs and reminiscences and things, which I tracked down for this division. And yes, there are far more than that you would come across from most other ones, indeed. Yeah.
Bill, quick one from me, if I may. So 48th Division were, I think, early adopters of the concept of flexible or elastic defense. And I wonder whether you thought that was a good or bad thing in terms of their performance.
You can't see it, I don't think, Derek, when they're in France, but you can see the elastic defense when they're in Italy.
I'm thinking about, for example, Skyline Trench. They were holding Skyline Trench very thinly and got kicked out of it. And I just wondered whether that was because of their approach to flexible defense. No,
I don't think they were doing elastic or flexible defense then. I think they were just manning trenches like everybody else was doing. You had defense in depth in a very sort of confined and narrow way in 1916 and early 1917, certainly. I think that we only began to understand, I say we, I mean, the British really only began to understand the elastic defense that the Germans were beginning to employ in 1917. We of course came across it at E, and sometimes to our advantage, because the Germans kept counterattacking and kept getting smashed by the artillery. And Fanshawe, I think, probably learned from that as well, because his elastic defense was different in that the Germans had it in order to regain lost land, whereas what Fanshawe was wanting was to make the blocking then into the pursuit, and to pursuit in the proper sort of military word, i.e. you're chasing a defeated enemy and you harass it in that way. So yeah, I don't think we can identify it in 1916 particularly.
Okay, that we haven't got any questions on the chat. But
is everyone asleep or watching the football?
Yeah, well, you're lucky it was the test match earlier, but
yeah,
but I'm recording the highlights. Anyway, there's been a lot of interest recently, as you will know, in the whole question of drafting policy. And suggestions, for example, that in the case of Western Command, that there was kind of more homogeneity in terms of or more of an attempt for varying reasons to maintain that kind of identity, at least a regional identity, if not a regimental identity.
Yeah.
And I wonder what your sense is of that in terms of 48th Division.
It's from the percentages which I worked out from Fatalities. It's fairly consistent as to where they came from, in that they do still seem to have pretty much a good regional identity, unlike the 61st, which changed quite substantially, I think, from the figures that I sort of produced from that. I would say that as far as the territorial divisions are concerned, the South Midland was probably one of the better ones after the Londons. But the Londons, I mean, what is London? It in the sense that, do you take it as being the M25 boundary, as it were, or what boroughs were constituted the LCC at the time, or whatever? So there's a far greater catchment area. But I think the South Midland, and then as you say, the Lancashire division, West and East Lancs, they might have had not Lancastrians, but they had an awful lot from Cheshire, or and some from Yorkshire as well, as it were. So yes, they had a good, or maintained, I think, a good regional identity. But the South Midland didn't do bad.
Yeah, I mean, we're lucky in Bucks in a way, because we've still got the casualty books for 1st Bucks.
Oh right.
And you know, there are a few survival. I mean, I think there are some casualty books that survive for the Norfolk Regiment, and I think there's some up in Shropshire, maybe something like that. There not many have survived, and through the Bucks archives, these are being transcribed and they've all been digitalized and so on. And what's interesting in a way is that when you suddenly get an influx of, as it were, strangers who aren't actually territorials or from Buckinghamshire, it's not until the autumn really of 1917 when there's a lot coming from the Army Service Corps, and then motor transport sections thereof, and then you immediately have a deterioration in discipline. Extraordinary number of offences are committed by the people who come from the ASC, who presumably have been very cushy jobs and have no wish to be in a frontline infantry battalion. But I mean, sadly, you know, there are so few of these kinds of sources that have survived that it's very difficult to really generalise.
Yeah, you're right. I'm sure it would be wonderful if there was more stuff of that around. As you know, I've always been interested in that sort of thing, and the identity. Tom Thorpe has done a lot of work on the London division.
That's right.
Well.
And then Alison Hine as well.
Yes, she was one of Pete Simpkins' students, I think, wasn't she? She's produced what is considered to be a really fine book. Yeah.
And I think we've got a postgrad at Kent who's doing that kind of work as well, Tom Davis.
Right.
So you know, it's coming along.
It's coming. Yeah.
Anyway, we don't seem to have any more questions from the audience, Bill. So thank you very much from me, and I'll now hand over to Derek.
Thank you very much.
Just going to share my screen for a second, if you just bear with me.
Yeah.
I'm very conscious that there is football on tonight, so I will not hold people up too much more. First of all, massive thank you on behalf of the Trust to Bill for an absorbing canter through the history of the 48th Division in the First World War. It's a subject that's very close to my own heart, as you can probably tell from my question. So thank you for that. I'd also like to thank Ian Beckett. Ian does all the legwork to set these lectures up, and we've had a really good response this year. So thank you, Ian, for all that you've done. And lastly, I'd like to say a really big thank you to the audience, because without you guys coming along and listening, there would be little point in us putting on these lectures. So thank you. A bit of an advert. This was the last of our spring-summer lecture series. We hope to be back in the autumn with some more. But in the meantime, we are reinstating our Viney Memorial Lecture this year. There's been a bit of a gap for 2 years due to COVID. And that's taking place on Sunday, the 26th of June at the Vincent Centre at the University of Buckingham in association with the Buckingham Literary Festival, where Dr. Rob Lyman will be talking about the Forgotten War, which is the war in Burma. It's on from 12:30 until 1:30 on Sunday the 26th, and tickets are available at the link below. But if you need to search for it, you can just search the Buck Literary Festival. And lastly, the lectures that we put on are always free, and we will always continue to offer them free. But the work that we do to maintain the military heritage and history of Buckinghamshire does not come free. So if you'd like to help us with that, you can donate via our website, and the link for that is on the screen now. Every little helps, so please go on there and have a look and see what you can do to help us. If you want to know more about what we do as a small charity to maintain the military history and heritage of Buckinghamshire, you can look on the website. You can follow us on our social media channels on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And please do. We would be grateful for an increase in the number of followers that we have. So please go on there, have a look, click follow. That's all from me. Another big thank you to Bill for entertaining us this evening with his lecture. And it just remains for me to say thank you very much and a very good night. And I hope England win.
Thank you very much, Derek, if I'm on mic, and to everyone who listens. Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.